Uspap page 260. Appraisal development and scope of work issues continued. Identified and the appraiser's opinion of their contributions to or negative influence on value must be developed by analysis of relevant market data. Bold added for emphasis. It should be noted that some assignment conditions, such as Fannie Mae appraisal guidelines, specify how sales or financing concessions are to be addressed in assignments that are subject to their guidelines. Appraisers performing assignments of this type should become familiar with all applicable guidelines in order to satisfy the requirements of the competency rule. Number 168. Intentionally deflating opinions of value. Question. Most appraisers know that inflating values is unethical, but some appraisers think that deflating values is acceptable, particularly in light of difficult market conditions. I think both actions are unethical. Am I correct? Response: yes. The ethics rule requires an appraiser to be independent, impartial, and objective, and to perform assignments without bias. An appraiser who intentionally inflates or deflates an opinion of value would be in violation of the conduct section of that rule. Number 169. Measuring single-family residences using the ANSI standard. Question. Are appraisers bound by Uspap required to comply with ANSI Z765-2003, the standards method of measuring square footage in detached and attached single-family houses? Response: no. Appraisers are not required by Uspap to comply with ANSI Z765-2003, which is a voluntary standard. However, use of the ANSI standards may be an assignment condition in some assignments. Although appraisers are not required by Uspap to adhere to a specific standard of square footage measurement, appraisers are required by Standards Rule 1-1B to not commit a substantial error of omission or commission that significantly affects an appraisal. This rule requires the appraiser to gather factual information in a manner that is sufficiently diligent. Standards Rule 1-1C requires appraisers to not render appraisal services in a careless or negligent manner. Appraisers must use due diligence and due care in performing appraisal services, including gathering factual data such as square footage. Number 170. Exposure time and marketing time. Question. What is the difference between exposure time and marketing time? Response. Both the definitions and advisory opinion number 35, reasonable exposure time in real and personal property market value opinions of value, define exposure time as an estimated length of time that the property interest being appraised would have been offered on the market prior to the hypothetical consummation of a sale at market value on the effective date of the appraisal. Comment. Exposure time is a retrospective opinion based on an analysis of past events, assuming a competitive and open market. In contrast, advisory opinion number 7, marketing time opinions, defines reasonable marketing time as An opinion of the amount of time it would likely take to sell a real or personal property interest at the concluded market value or at a benchmark price during the period immediately after the effective date of an appraisal. Page 261. In other words, exposure time occurs before, that's highlighted, the effective date of the appraisal, whereas marketing time occurs after, that's highlighted, the effective date. An estimate of reasonable exposure time is required by Uspap for most market value appraisal assignments. See Standards Rule 1-2C, Roman numeral 4, and 7-2C, Roman numeral 4, whereas an estimate of marketing time is not mandated by Uspap, but may be required by the client, and so becomes an assignment condition in those assignments. For additional guidance, see Advisory Opinion number 35 and Advisory Opinion number 7. Number 171, Marketing Time on Appraisal Forms. Question: I am completing a market value appraisal. I use standard pre-printed residential report forms that ask for a neighborhood marketing time. Does marketing time on these forms mean the same thing as exposure time as it is used in Uspap? Response: no. Although the two may be the same length of time, the meanings are different. The exposure time opinion required by Uspap is specific to the subject property and represents the length of time the subject would likely have been listed for sale prior to a hypothetical sale of the subject property on the effective date of the appraisal. Marketing time in this context is the typical length of time the properties in that neighborhood would be expected to be on the market prior to a sales agreement. As explained in Advisory Opinion number 35, reasonable exposure time in real and personal property opinions of value. Exposure time is dependent on the characteristics of the subject property and the market conditions as of the effective date. Most residential appraisal report forms have a field in which the appraiser must enter an opinion of the neighborhood marketing time. However, most residential appraisal report forms do not, that's underlined, have a field for which the appraiser must report the reasonable exposure time. The comment, that's underlined, to Standards Rule 1-2C Roman numeral 4 requires the appraiser to develop an opinion of reasonable exposure time whenever developing an opinion of value, where exposure time is a component of the definition for the value opinion being developed. The comments to Standards Rule 2-2A Roman numeral 5 and B Roman numeral 5 require the appraiser to communicate the opinion of reasonable exposure time in the appraisal report. Number 172, exposure time value range. Question: I understand that reasonable exposure time needs to be developed and reported in cases when it is a component of the definition of the value opinion being developed. However, Advisory Opinion number 35, reasonable exposure time in real and personal property opinions of value seems to suggest that a range of values is required when reporting exposure time. Does this mean I must reference a range of values when I report my opinion of reasonable exposure time? Response: no. A range of values is not required when reporting an opinion of reasonable exposure time. However, The appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time must be linked to an opinion of value, whether it is a specific value or a range of values. As stated in advisory opinion number 35, the reasonable exposure period is a function of price, time, and use, not an isolated opinion of time alone. End of page.